Welcome to In Flight Running, the radio show with your host, Coach Michael Merlino. Get ready to run strong and go the distance with expert run coaching advice to take your running to new heights. Whether you are just getting started with the sport or ready to shoot for a new personal best at any distance, we have something to offer runners of all skill levels. On your mark, get set, go! Here is Coach Michael Merlino.
All right, today's show. So what's on tap for today, guys? Well, it's May 1st, and as a running coach and a marathon coach, for me, that signals that we're almost about to kick off the beginning of a fresh new marathon training season here in Houston and pretty much throughout the country as people wrap it up, kind of ramp up that mileage, get ready for some of the upcoming races across the U.S. and around the world, for that matter. Those would be the fall race series and fall period, probably October to December, and then what I call the winter races, which are more like first quarter of next year. So today I'm going to offer some tips on getting your body and your mind prepared for the long training season that lies ahead. As you map out your running goals, your big race goal, and kind of inch towards that big goal of completing your next marathon or half marathon. So today's show will be specifically talking about marathoning and half marathoning. Okay. So nothing like a clean slate. I love the promise of a new year. You just hit the reset button. So today I want to give you tips as a coach to get some real nice momentum and just get you thinking about what you need to be doing in that next season based on what your goals are. Okay, so we're going to get into that today. During the first segment, I'll be talking about things, talking about picking your race goal, mapping out your training. We'll also talk about kind of giving yourself a personal assessment of where you are with your running now to kind of dictate where you're going to go with your running, because we all have goals, but you got to take a hard look at where you're at now and how you're going to get there. So we're going to talk about that. In the final segment, we'll wrap it up and I'll give you some more tips and final thoughts on just getting ready to rock, getting prepped up for that next marathon. Okay, so it's that time of year. We got to reapply our running game face to start building up those miles, because 13.1 and 26.2 is not a small feat, so we got to get that going. So snow's finally melted in the northern United States. It's heating up here in Texas, which can only mean it's time to dust off those running shoes, get that solid base going if you've lost some of that, to ramp up for your marathons and half marathons. So today I want to give you some tips on how to map out your racing and your training. Whether you've kept your base in the off season, lost your edge a bit, or took way too much time off, been hitting the couch too much, May is the time to really get things going. So let's get right into that right now. Okay, give you some tips. So first I'd start, guys, is, and I do this when I have coffee talks with my runners here in Houston, but I would review and reflect on the previous training season. I mean, there's no better way to set goals than to take a look at how you trained, how you performed, and how you raced during the previous season. Okay, so take a look at those race times, and you want to assess all that. So if you don't have a running log of any form, I would highly recommend at this point, if you're going into a new season, is I'm an old-fashioned, old-school kind of guy, just writing things down. They've got some great little running logs you can pick up at Barnes & Noble and get them online, because I like to put details on how I felt that day and the weather conditions and things like that. You can do this electronically too, with a lot of apps online that help you with that. So you really need to, if you have a training log, you want to go back to that. Look at last season. What kind of miles were you logging weekly? What type of injuries popped up, when they popped up? What other type of cross-training activities you had in there, if you did have them? Take a look at all that. And like I said, if you don't have one, start logging those things now as you go into the next season, because next year you'll need to take a look at that. I'd also review your GPS data. So if you're a Garmin person or Polar or whatever you use, you can dump a lot of this data online now. So I would take a look at that data, take a look at your racing, kind of get a feel for what you were doing with your training. Ask yourself what worked well last season. Stick to those things that you know worked well, whether that be nutrition or training practices or whatever you were doing. What did not work well and what was lacking with your training. And the most important thing is what got in the way of you nailing that weekly mileage. So, And then I like to do is jot down ways you're going to avoid some of those roadblocks that got in the way, whether it's shifting your run to a different time of day, finding that me time for you so you can get that training time or those miles in that you need to get ready to train for a marathon or a half marathon. If you didn't have any interval training in your program, now I'm talking about speed, track workouts, speed workouts, hill training. You may want to add that. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. If you did not consistently strength train, I'm a huge believer you need to have that in there as a runner, because runners break down pretty quickly with the miles, and building some muscle is going to get toughen you up a little bit. If you didn't have any non-weight bearing cardio cross training, I would be adding that to your program. I'm talking elliptical trainer, spinning, cycling, things that work your heart yet give your body and your legs a break from some of the weight, most of the weight bearing wear and tear that you put on your body when you run. Okay. So I would look at, where you were lacking and just kind of shore those areas up. Another area I would look at is, doing more stretching. I think that's huge, especially post-run. Most of the research says that you should spend most of your time post-run stretching. So I'd get into that. If you need to jump in a yoga class, experiment with that. That's a good way to just force the issue, get into a class each week that's going to help with your flexibility, okay? It's also a good time to gear up. We got a new training season coming up, so this is a good time to go to your local running store here in Houston. My guys are Fleet Feet Houston. Head out to a running store, do some shopping, treat yourself to some new gear. And do you have the necessary tools to get through next season? Obviously you definitely need a new pair of shoes, see what new type of stuff is out there. And I would recommend trying some new things, some new lines of shoes. Look at all that. A lot of gadgets and apps and things you can add on your phone. We've gone over that in previous shows, like Map My Run and Mick Run, which is a great app that can allow you to get a better handle on your pacing based on your current race times. If you've been holding back and investing in things like a GPS watch or a heart rate monitor, I love the Mio watch, which is a wrist heart rate monitor. That works really good. This would be the time to maybe go out and buy a new device. The Garmin Forerunner 620 is probably the gold standard one that gives you tons of data you can look at, not only just heart rate and pacing, but foot speed and cadence and levels of trunk rotation, things like that. I love the Garmin Forerunner 10, which retails for about $129. Very simple watch. You just hit run and go with just the amount of data points that you're going to really need. A lot of us won't even tap most of the data you're going to have on some of those high-end watches. Probably won't even use most of that, okay? You want to get a good gauge of your current state. What type of shape are you in? So if you're coming off a recent marathon or half marathon, I would make sure you're adequately recovered before you start rebuilding your mileage, okay? If you haven't been doing much lately, then I would focus on low mileage runs, little baby 3 to 4 to 5 milers, every other day. Take every other day off at first, but just get out the door and do some short mileage and make those frequent and make those aerobic, really more easy runs, okay? Spend a few weeks getting in some consistent mileage like that. If you have some base intact and you've maintained that in the off season, I'd get out and just run a really fast 5K, 10K, see where your numbers are at with that. If you don't have access to a 5K locally, then just go to your local high school track and do a 1 mile time trial. Just warm up, stretch, run 1 mile as fast as your legs can carry you. And you can take that and you can use that in some of these calculators like Macmillan calculator to at least get some type of feel of what you should be pacing out at early in the season, okay? I'm going to actually be going back to old school 1 mile time trials with my runners, and I'm going to recommend to those that have not been racing lately that they come out to the track with me, time them on a 1 mile run, and give them some estimates of what their pacing should be so they're not just shooting in the dark at the beginning of their training, okay? So let's carry on that conversation. We're going to get into picking your race and looking at race goals and things like that. So let's take a quick break. When we return, I'll be talking about using your personal numbers to determine your training and pacing goals and the importance of race training schedules. We'll be back in 3 minutes.
You are listening to In Flight Running with Coach Michael Merlino. Now, back to In Flight Running.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Coach Michael Merlino, and you're listening to In Flight Running. Let's continue our discussion today, guys, on tips to get your next marathon or half marathon training season going as we head into a brand new long training season to get you ready for both fall and winter races. So next I want to get into the numbers, because plain and simple, running is a numbers game. So you have to log and pay attention to your numbers during your training. And it's all about numbers, heart rate, pacing, you name it. So we got to really pay attention to those. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to kind of determine, as you go into your training season, even this early on, what you should be pacing at based on current race times. You want to get fancy with it. You could go out and get a VO2 max test, and you could train by heart rate. But we're going to talk specifically about pacing today, okay, and how to determine that. So I've mentioned this in previous shows. I'm a huge fan of McMillan, Greg McMillan, one of the best, in my opinion, marathon coaches in the country, coaches a lot of the elite marathoners here in the U.S. He's got a great website. You can go to mcmillanrunning.com, but he's got one of the best running calculators, which basically is calculators you put in recent race data at a particular distance, and it's going to spit out or calculate predicted race times at other distances, and it's going to also predict what type of pacing you should be doing with your training based on what your goal is for that particular training run, okay, which should vary a little bit during the week. We're going to get into that, okay? So I'm going to use an example today, and I rolled this through McMillan calculator. By the way, McMillan also has a great app called McRun. I've got it on my phone. In fact, this year I'm going to have all my coaches loaded on their phones, so when they're talking to people about pacing, they can easily have these discussions with people and show them what their pacing should be. Okay? So basically it interpolates the data. It uses all these running algorithms. You guys may have seen it on runnersworld.com that give an estimate of what pacing should be based on some baseline or racing data. Okay, so we're going to go over just a fictitious guy named Scott today to kind of give you an example of this. Scott is a guy who has some base intact. He ran a marathon last season. He's been kind of tinkering with some 5Ks and 10Ks. He's been running, say, in the off season, he's been pretty consistent with a 6 to 8 mile long run, 3 to 4 mile midweek runs, maybe running about 4 to 5 times a week, okay? So if Scott were my client or one of my runners, I'd say, Scott, go out and run. Just go bust a 5K, man. Find a 5K out there, which is a 3.1 mile race. Run that race hard as you can. Get a really quality time, meaning, it's got to be fast. You got to give it full effort, preferably on a good weather day, which is tough to get here in Texas this time of year, even though it's been pretty cool. And then you take that data. In this case, Scott went out and ran a 29:45. Not a PR for him, but that was his most recent data. So you plug that data into the McMillan calculator or his McRun app, and that comes up with some predictions on race time. So based on that 29:45 time, Scott at this point in time, snapshot in time as far as his fitness level, could expect to run a 10K at 1 hour, 1 minute, 47 seconds. He's on target for a half marathon of 2:17:44. Marathon 4:49:53. So that's kind of training this guy stuff now, because he's got a lot of weeks to put in. Those estimates may change, and interpolating out data from a 5K to a marathon is not the most accurate, but at least he's got something he can start thinking about, okay? Now, we get into training, it tells you a lot. So McMillan also allows you to look at training paces, which to me is the most important. So on my training schedules, I have an easy run for long run, a T or a training run, which is kind of your bread and butter training pace during the week, a P run for pacing, where you crank up that T run a notch and do some intermittent fartleks or surges or pickups, and then we do some stuff on the track. So what's really cool about, for speed training, intervals up, he gives that whole gamut. So for example, with Scott, the calculator said he needs to be running his easy pace on long runs, 10:50 to 11:37. His training run, bread and butter training run, should be like a 10-minute to about a 10:30. When he kicks those intervals up a notch during that training run and he's doing a pacing run, when he's intermittently kind of kicking that up, he should kick that up to, say, like a 9:30 to a 10-minute pace. And then when he gets on the track, it's even telling him that his 400-meter interval should be 2:04 to 2:12, 800, 419 to 431. 1 mile repeats, 9:12 to 9:34 pace per mile, okay? The 400 and 800 is total because we're doing less than a mile, okay? So that kind of gives you an idea. It's nice to have these numbers and work with them, even if they're estimates. It's a lot better than guessing or overpacing, because that normally is what gets people in trouble and gets them injured, okay, down the road. So you want to also play what if with your numbers, so you can work backwards with this, okay? I'm also a big believer that a lot of runners, a lot of people are going after the bling and they're all about the medals. I get that, but I think a lot of people have a big goal, their primary goal, and they're just rolling out way too many races. And then we have other people that just aren't running or racing much at all, so they have no data to use to figure out what their pacing should be for their training. So those are both issues, okay? One's going to break you down more and take your legs out for your major race, and the other is not going to give you any type of feedback, okay? So you can also look at the 5K, 10K. I like to look at 10K for marathoners, 5K for half marathoners, but look at the short distances. And you can play what if with the calculator, like what if, like Scott's was at, 29:56. What if Scott got his 5K down to a 27-minute 5K? How would that affect his predicted marathon and half marathon pace? How would that affect his pacing for that run? And if he does get a new PR, he gets that 27 during the season, Scott now earns his right to increase his pacing across the board for all those different types of runs I mentioned, okay? But you're doing it systematically, you're using science, you're not just guessing, once again, okay? So I'm a big believer that a lot of folks should be rolling out some 5Ks early in the season or off season, running 5s and 10s. We get into season strategically placing 10Ks throughout the season to kind of have some checkpoints. If you're if a half marathoner, those may be 5Ks. And then as we get closer to your goal race, your marathon or half marathon, prior to your peak long run, which for a marathoner is going to be 20 plus, for a half marathoner is going to be 12 to 13, that's when you go out and you do a tune-up race. I'm talking 4 to 6 weeks out. Go run a half marathon, run it hard, get a solid half marathon time that you can put into the calculator to interpolate out to what your goal would be for the marathon. Half marathoners, I like the 10K distance for that. So that way you don't take too much out of your legs. You're getting a good estimate that you can kind of play with and train with as you lead up to your goal race, okay? So you can try that. If your big goal is improving your personal best, then you want to know these numbers along the way, because most people improve during a training season. Our training season is 7 months, so I would expect if people are running the schedule the way I lay it out, that they're going to be better runners, not worse runners. So you got to check those numbers by just getting out and racing. Here in Houston, we've got a great free Houston Wellness 5K series that's free on Sunday. So I tell a lot of my runners to go out there and just do that. It doesn't cost a penny, and you can get some solid race times. You want to set your running goals and pick your races. So review your recent race times and set your goal for your marathon. If you ran a 4:10, maybe you want to break a 4 this year. Most people want to get under a certain threshold, or that they're shooting for. You want to be realistic with your goals. Obviously, most people are not going to improve by 45 minutes, an hour on their marathon time, even though a lot of my beginners, if they catch fire and they do the training right and they ran a 5-hour marathon, I've seen people bust a 4:15. So it's doable, but you want to be realistic about, your improvement, or your predicted or your projected improvement, okay? Of course, it's all about location when you're picking races. Obviously, a lot of us that want to get a PR or maybe get to Boston, they're picking pretty flat races for obvious reasons. The hilly stuff will totally take it out of your legs. There's a lot of net downhill races that are fast, but they'll chew up your quads too, so you got to train for that. get your legs used to the downhills. For cooler weather, I always look for fall races or spring races that are as far north as I can go in the United States, and usually that's going to end up being in Canada. If we're in Texas, we've had people that head off to Toronto and Hamilton. Ottawa, those are fall races. Ottawa has one of the fastest and flattest race in Canada. That's in May. That's a great one to look at if you want to do a spring race. Really flat and fast course. I always look at the course elevation on the website, though, because every race director is going to describe their race like it's a vacation brochure. So they're going to put stuff on there like mostly flat course. Well, mostly flat course means there's probably some hills in there, folks. So you want to take a look at the true elevation. Normally you can Google that and find the true elevation for that race before you, plunk your money down for that race. Okay. So I'll tell you what, let's, I'll just hit this quick point yet, and then we'll go to break. But you want to check out, there's a great website, marathonguide.com. So check that out. It's a very comprehensive list of marathons in the U.S. and Canada and overseas. Big advantage of marathon.com is you can look at reviews that have been written by people who have actually run those races. So if there's any potential problem with a race, where people hated it or reasons people loved it, you'll find it there in the review section that's marathonguide.com. Okay? So let's take a quick break. We're going to continue our discussion on pacing and setting your goals for your next marathon. So just want to remind you guys, if you need a race training schedule, that In-Flight Running can provide you with that online. We can write it on. You can have access to it online for your next race. You can actually have access to it on your smartphone. Pretty cool. So if you're interested in that, just email us at info@inflightrunning and include the words training schedule in the subject line, and I'll send you some information out on that, okay? When we return, we'll be offering up some other tips and give you some fresh wrinkles on ways you can, or things you can add to your training program that you may not have thought about before. We'll be back in 3 minutes.
You are listening to In-Flight Running with Coach Michael Merlino. Now, back to In-Flight Running.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Coach Michael Merlino, and you've been listening to In-Flight Running. We're going to continue our discussion today, guys, on getting you ready, getting you kind of fired up and kind of, prepared for the upcoming half marathon training season. So I was talking about when I left you after the last break, or before the last break, talking about marathonguide.com is a great way to go kind of race shopping, kind of pick out a race. I highly recommend that. I'm also building a new race calendar on the new inflightrunning.com page. I'll have that up, I'm hoping, in early May. That'll be a national race calendar, so you can check that out soon, okay? So I just want to mention that. So as far as training schedules, I want to get into that. One of the keys to training up for a marathon or half marathon is the schedule. I mean, without a training schedule, you're really not training for much. So obviously here in Houston with my runners, the ones that physically run with me, with my group, they also get provided a race schedule for whatever races they're going to run during the season. We provide that. I write those for them. They have access to those online and on their phone, so they know exactly what they need to be doing as far as mileage. Okay, so you need to have that. Like I've said many times before, if you have access to a local training group or coach that provides a schedule like us, that's the way to go. I'd highly recommend you get with a group that provides all that. If you don't have access to that in your area, you need to get your hands on a training schedule. I do sell training schedules at In-Flight Running. I mentioned that the last break. So if you do need a schedule, by all means, call me or email me, and I can provide that for you if you need that, okay? If you're in the middle of nowhere, you just don't have a training group in your area, we can do that. You can find some free training schedules online without the coaching. So if you're in that situation, I would recommend picking up any book by Jeff Galloway. Jeff Galloway was an Olympian for the United States. He's written tons of books on marathoning. That way you get the schedule and you get a great book that's going to give you a lot of knowledge, especially if you're a beginner or a newbie. Okay, so I'd pick up one of those books, use one of his schedules. That way you've got a great learning resource to go with it. Whatever you do, if you look online, there's tons of schedules out there that are free. Please do not go with a 12 or 16-week schedule to get ready for a marathon or half marathon if you're not in shape or if you're a newbie. Even my experienced runners, I think they really need months, not weeks. So most of my training schedules, even if a guy's training for Chicago and starting in May, that race comes early October, minimum 5 months to train for that, so I'm a really big believer in more weeks, not less, okay? There's other things you want to take a look at too. Really thinking about what race you want to run. The fall marathons come early. Big Cottonwood, Utah, a lot of people are doing that. Chicago, DC Marine Corps, New York City. Those give you, like I said, that 5 to 6 months to train. And then the other winter races come after that. Houston Marathon here is in January. Disney, all those are what I call the winter races, which are later. Okay. Our training season is long for a few reasons, though, because I want the newbies, and we start in May and we end the following February, because I want the newbies to get more time to gel and build that base. Gives people that have those early races more, they can get going and they can get ready for those early races. And then those that want to, maybe cram 2 marathons or 2 half marathons into the season, they can actually do that with a longer training season. That's why ours is probably the longest in Houston at about, I think 40 weeks total, 39, 40 weeks total. Okay. If you can't get in the major marathon, there's ways to get in. New York City Marathon, there's a great Team for Kids organization, the Fred LeBeau Foundation. You can get in through charity, raise some money and get in. Chicago or New York also, I would love you to check out the Reeves Foundation. That's Christopher Reeves Foundation to gain entry. I'm going to have somebody with Reeves on shortly to talk about how to gain entry to that. And you don't have to raise as much money as you would think to get in those races that have lotteries. And of course, Houston Marathon's dropping their lottery this year. You can get in Houston. That opens June 3rd. It's first come, first serve now. They've dropped the marathon. So I'd love you to come to our great city and run what I think is one of the flattest half marathon courses in the country now, and a pretty darn flat marathon too. They changed those courses 2 years ago and made them both a lot easier. So take a look at that. Okay. Let's move forward. I want to talk about some new wrinkles I think that you may want to add to your training. And, being a 51-year-old runner myself, I've had to start getting a little crafty in my old age. So I'm always experimenting with things and kind of play mad scientist with my own body, because I figure if it works for a guy like me who's in pretty good shape, but I'm older, then it's probably going to work for the 25-year-old in my group, the 40-year-old in my group. So I'm always kind of taking a look at these things, reading things and trying things out so I can train smarter and get better results with less in some cases. Okay. So these are things you may want to try out, just some new wrinkles that I've read about and you may have heard of, but I'm going to try to kind of give you a quick rundown on these. So we'll get into long run specifically, one thing I'm really doing a lot of is I'm just kind of getting hip to trail running now. I'm doing a lot more trail running. It's a little bit easier on the body and get out there in the woods, have some fun. It's a little bit more adventuresome. It relieves some stress. It gives your body a new challenge. It's, like I said, it's a lot less load on your body regardless of your age, okay? Another thing I'm doing is alternating, and I did this with a Jeff Galloway schedule. Back when I PR'd my race, I have a 3:30 PR, my gosh, back 10 years ago, is alternating long runs with 1 mile repeats. For example, you do a long run, say you're doing a 12 miler, but then the next week you don't do a long run, you do like a 6 by 1 mile repeat workout, really fast with minimal recovery in between your intervals. That's crazy because you get to the point where you're doing about a 22 mile long run and then you're following that with a 13 by 1 mile repeat workout. And that's pretty gut busting, but it works. It's not for everybody, but if you're in good shape and you can handle those speed workouts, that's something you may want to go to. I'm going to probably tinker with that a little this year, okay? Another thing is to get more midweek mileage in. the Hanson brothers made this famous, but this is kind of weird and it's a tough sell, but you don't do more than a 16-mile long run, but you amp up your mileage during the week, a lot of double-digit runs during the week, okay? So you wouldn't even really go over a 20-mile training run, which is really tough for a lot of people to wrap their head around. It's not for everybody because a lot of people don't have time to knock down a 10, 12-mile long run twice during the week, not in the long run, okay? I like to do finish strong workouts where where in that final 5K or 3 miles of a just long run, you ratchet up your speed. So I like to go with predicted 15K pace 3 miles out, then I ratchet down to a predicted 10K pace a little faster, 2 miles out, and I finish my last mile strong with a 5K pace. It gives you a little kick, lets you practice that final kick during a race. It just kind of mixes it up a little bit. It's really good to do that here, especially in Texas when we get cooler weather, which is not that often during the summer, but if it's a cooler day, that's something you can do. Also, you can add some predicted marathon or half marathon pacing during the middle miles of a long run. So say you're doing a 12-mile run or 16-mile run, you can put about 3 miles worth of cranking up a notch to your predicted marathon pace in the middle of that long run. Okay, to kind of simulate what you would be doing on race day based on an estimate, okay? More frequent, another thing I'm looking at, an interesting thing that I was doing, didn't really even know it, but more frequent running or accumulating more weekly miles in shorter distances per run or bout of running, okay? So this gets a little creative with your miles. This gets back to the old-fashioned ditching your car, running to the drugstore and back, 1 mile there, 1 back. Adding, you park your car in your downtown area, running to your office or jogging to your office, things like that. So all these things add up to a more conditioned body and sneaking in miles, doing things you would have normally done anyway, okay? So I'm gonna just hold that thought on that. I want to give you a lot more details on this because there's a new article that was in Running Times magazine that goes over that. Okay, so I'm going to get into, just take a quick break here. For more information on In-Flight Running's Houston area group run coaching programs from the 5K to the marathon distance, check out our website at inflightrunning.com. When we return, I'm going to continue my discussion, give you guys some new things to maybe add to your training. If we get some last-minute questions here, we may take some of those on the show. So we'll be back in 3 minutes.
You are listening to In-Flight Running with Coach Michael Merlino. Now, back to In-Flight Running.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Coach Michael Merlino, and you're listening to In-Flight Running. I want to continue my discussion, guys, on giving you some new wrinkles, some new things to maybe add to your training. These are things that kind of come, the thing I was talking about is before we went to break was adding miles to your life, to your training without really thinking about it too much. So I was reading a recent article in Running Times magazine, and this gets back when I was talking about how, we need to go back to maybe not using the car as much. Which people in Houston will really love that because we love our cars in Houston. That sums up why we've got so much traffic in this town. But we talked about just little bouts of week, and I'm talking it could be a quarter of a mile, it could be running from your car to your office, whatever. All this stuff adds up and it conditions the body and it gets your it's a way to get your weekly miles. And so this was illustrated in a new article that was in the May-June 2015 edition of Running Times magazine. It just hit my mailbox last week, and it was entitled "Everything You Ever Needed to Know About Running Was Discovered in 1937." So the article highlights the simple and yet effective training techniques of a guy who's probably the most prolific winner of the Boston Marathon. His name was Clarence DeMar, otherwise known as Mr. DeMarathon, is what they called him. And it offers feedback from today's experts on DeMar's training techniques and why what he was doing back then made sense. He offered these up in a book he wrote way back in 1937 that kind of highlighted these things. So he's a guy who was first 100-plus miler in 1927 when he was preparing for the Boston Marathon. He shocked the world and he said, "Hey, I'm at 100 miles a week." And everyone, of course, everyone and their uncle thought the guy was crazy anyway because people weren't running marathons. But he was the first guy that really kind of shot for that 100-mile threshold, okay? So the way he did it, and by the way, DeMar ran or won the Boston Marathon 7 times between 1911 and 1930. In 1927, he won a bronze medal at the Olympics. So his basic philosophy, and he's got a few that he shares in this article, but specific to mileage, is to put less intense yet more frequent activity or running into each week to get those miles in. So a lot of us lose sleep over the fact that we missed a run, and oh my gosh, I'll miss my 6-mile run, and and you try to catch up with it, or you just table it. So what his thought behind this was, like, for example, he talks about in the book where he had a garden. He'd run a mile to his garden, tend to his garden, and he'd run back, and then he'd have his training run later in the day. So I've done this for years, not thinking about it, like when, I was like even when I was in corporate, I would be downtown Houston and I would run to my car and I'd run back and didn't think much of it, but I've been doing it lately. Give an example, daring my 10-year-old to run to a particular landmark, and I race him to something. I was joking with the other day about how we're gonna run to the drugstore that's a half a mile away and run back with our backpack. And he's like, why are we going to do that? We got a car. So just small little bouts of this really add up. And exercise physiologist in the article said, yeah, he was pretty much onto something, So it's a way to get adequate miles in just little chunks without just killing yourself, okay? He covers that in the book. He also talks in the book about some other things like he gets into, I'd highly recommend, I don't even know if it's in print yet. I'm trying to find one on Amazon right now, but it was just called Marathon was the name of the book. I'm not saying going out and run 100 miles a week like DeMar did or like a lot of these pros do, but, it all adds up. Mile is a mile. An extra half mile for the week is an extra, half mile of time or distance on the road that you're putting in, okay? It'll make up for maybe one of those runs you missed, and if you're nailing your schedule, you're getting some bonus mileage in. I think as marathoners, we get a little bit snobby with our running, and if we can't run 4 to 6, it doesn't count. But every foot strike, every step counts, is what I'm saying, guys. So you may want to put this into play and do that. Whether it's playing a little small pickup basketball game with your kid, or running to the store, or jogging to the store, or whatever. It all adds up, and I'm telling you, it's working with my training, and it's been proven to work. So take a look at that. So if you're gunning for a 13.1 or 26.2 mile finish line in medal, this is a year to do it, guys. So even if whether you're a newbie, shooting for the finish line, really think about these things. Kind of get in your groove now. You got 4 weeks before we hit June. You kind of get some base going here, okay? It's probably a good time to buy a new pair of shoes, so you can start wearing some of the tread off of them. Get out there, get fitted for a new pair of shoes, just kind of start building that weekly miles up. Maybe go get some new gear. Think about getting a GPS or a Garmin watch, things like that, okay? So I hope today's show gave you a nice little kick in the pants, some things to think about, and maybe some things you may want to add to your own training, how to tweak some of your long runs and things. Put these tips into play so your next training season is a great one, and you can crush that next PR or that next big race goal that's on your calendar, okay? If you live in Houston, I'd love to have you on my training team. For more information on our group run coaching program here in Houston, you can check out the website. That's inflightrunning.com. If you're outside the Houston area, as I mentioned, I can train you online, no problem. I do it through Skype, provide you with a training schedule for whatever marathon of the world you want to run. Works pretty well for those folks that don't have access to a coach in their hometown, okay? So, that's it for today's show, guys. Remember, it's always a good day to start a running program or pick a goal race and shoot for it. Thanks for tuning in today, and I hope you join us the next time on the In-Flight Running Show. Have a great weekend, and as always, run strong and onward to the finish line. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to In-Flight Running with your host, Coach Michael Merlino. Have a great weekend and run strong.